The next one is, what is a measure? What is it? Now we will take a look at the measure. Measure in Power BI are used for defining the calculation or formula. Even using calculated column, we define the formula. Similarly, even using measure, we can define the formula. But we use measure in general to perform aggregations, like sum function, average function, right? Unlike calculated column, it is not pre-calculated. This can be an advantageous, but there is a flip side attached to that. It is not pre-calculated. Let's say in this case, I have created the total sales measure. Okay, this is a total sales measure. When I click on it, you can see there is a measure. This measure name is total sales. Similarly, this was also a measure. 3 measures I created it. Let's start with this measure. This measure, on the right side of this one, it performs the sum on the sales column, and then the output will get stored in this measure. You cannot see the value stored in the total sales instantly. Only when you drag and drop this measure into your visual, in this case, the table is the visual, you can see the value stored in your total sales column. So it is pre-calculated. So it is not pre-calculated. The measure, only when you drag and drop it here, it will get computed on the fly. Hence, it requires, it is a CPU intensive process. It is a CPU intensive process, whereas the calculated column or memory intensive, it requires more memory, but it is already, we calculated the data and we stored it there. But here, every time, whenever you drag and drop it, it will get recalculated. Other thing is, for example, when I make a selection in my filter, whenever I make changes here, this one will get recalculated. It requires a lot of computations. Hence, it is CPU intensive. The measure is not going to live in your data set. Rather, it is calculated on the fly whenever called upon. That's why I explained it. So this measure is not stored in memory. Unlike calculated column, it's not stored in memory. It can be reused on other measures. The same measure I can reuse it on other measures that I will show you with other example. Don't worry, okay? And measures recalculate each time when the user changes the filter or the values in a slicer, and can cause your report to respond slowly. The volume of the data is very high, and if the calculation or the business rule which you are using it here in the measure or very complex one, your report will be very slow. Okay, it will not reflect immediately. It will take some time. And again, depends, if the volume of the data is very high, it will add more burden on your system. Now you got a fair amount of idea what is the difference between calculated column and measure. There are within measure, there are 2 types. One is the implicit measure. The other one is the explicit measure. What do you mean by implicit measure? The auto summarization is a classic example, right? That is done by Power BI automatically. It applies on the numeric column is called your implicit measure. For example, here, as soon as you load the data into your Power BI desktop, right below this fields pane, you will find this table name, column name, and any column which just in front of any column you find sigma. That is your implicit measure. It applies, right? The auto summarization, the automatic summarization happens on this numeric column automatically. Okay, we did not create any measure, but when you click on the sales column, when you click on it double time, and you can see that the sales is a decimal number data type. And if you see on the right side, summarization, look here, it use sum. This is auto summarization. Okay, so this is called your implicit measure. I just show you one more time. I create another table here. Look here, I just drag and drop it here. 67,000. Look here, this is my total, isn't it? So this is my total. In this case, I have created a measure, total sales. But here I did not create any measure. The moment when I dragged and dropped it, automatically it gives me the total sales. This is called auto summarization. It is also called as an implicit measure. Okay, so the implicit measure is not necessarily always sum. You can change it. For example, if I select sales here, and you can go and change it here, average or minimum. But it is not a good practice. Don't change it here. You can use your DAX function and you can do it. Hope you understood what is implicit measure. So in the case of sales, and if you see quantity, there is some, we don't see it here. There is some text data type problem here. We need to address it. Okay. So the sales column, any column, if you see, the sigma notation along with the columns, right? Those columns are numeric data type. Number one. Number two is those columns are auto summarized column. Okay. They aggregates on its own. Okay. You don't have to write some function at all explicitly. The explicit measure is the one which we created. Like I have shown you the total sales. Look here, total sales. These three measures I created. This is called a explicit measure. We explicitly created the measure. Okay, now we will compare side by side. What is the difference between calculated column and versus measures? Calculated column stored. The difference. The calculated columns are stored in memory, whereas measure is not stored in memory, and it calculates at the time of report refresh, and it consumes memory, and row by row calculation is done usually. For example, if you want to compute the profit, they'll ask an example here. You can give the profit. You have something on sales amount minus cost, right? Cost of goods sold. If you subtract the cost of goods sold from your sales amount, you get the profit or margin. And the difference between these are, it is stored in memory, it is not stored in memory. It is calculated at the time of refresh, but it's calculated on the fly, and it consumes CPU. And here, usually it is a result of an aggregation. Okay, here it is not necessarily aggregation. You remember list price into quantity gave me the sales amount, but there we are multiplying the columns. We are not doing the aggregation. Aggregation is sum of sales, sum of units sold or quantity, average sales. These are aggregation function. Measure, we use it most of the time to perform some kind of like sum function. Okay, we use it. So these are the difference between the calculated column and measure. So now the question is, when can I use calculated column? When can I use measure? I got stuck here and I got confused here. Most of the beginners, they get confused here. This is a $1 billion question. So here we have seen here, if you see here, the total sales, if I select this visual got highlighted. On the right side here, you can see what are the columns that are the measures that I used it, columns and measures. You can see it in this table visual. Okay, category column, total sales. Total sales is a measure. Total sales, sum is a measure. And sales amount. Yes, so this is sum and sales amount. This is the one is a calculated column. You remember? How many of you remember? For example, here. Look here on the right side, I create the sales amount, right? This column is a calculated column. I just use the calculated column here. But if I use the measure or calculated column, it gives me the same output. So which one can I use it? If the volume of the data is very, 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 very huge, and if your table has got a lot of columns in it already, then try to use measure instead of using, or let's say, let's put it this way, scenario one. Your data volume is not so high. It is reasonably okay, but the number of columns are more. If you add additional columns, it consumes more memory. Since the volume of the data is not so high, better I avoid creating a calculated column. Instead, I will go ahead with creating a measure, because the measure will not store the value in your table. Okay. And okay, the next question is, in that case, scenario one is fine. What about the other scenarios? Let's say you are using a column in your filter condition, especially the DAX query. In that kind of situation, obviously you need to have the calculated column. And if you want to define an experience that is bound to the current row, then row by row calculation. If you want to perform it, then you have to use calculated column. And if you want to use the value in rows or columns of a pivot table, in that case, you can go for calculated column. And you remember, I have shown you in the matrix how to, what is the row field, what is column field, and when the drill down option get enabled automatically, right? So in that kind of situation, pivot table matrix, using matrix, you can create the pivot table. In the interview, they'll ask you, can you tell me how to create a pivot table? We have matrix visual using which we can create the pivot table. Okay, just by swapping the values from your rows to columns, the columns to rows, we can convert the rows, the values from columns to rows and rows to columns using pivot table. That is what pivoting, right? Pivoting and pivoting, I can do it using matrix by swapping the values between rows and columns. In order to do that, I need to have, in that kind of situations, if I have a calculated column, it'll be good. And use the value in a slicer. Let's say you have created a slicer here. This slicer, for this, you don't have a column available already in your existing data set. You have created a calculated column, right? Do some kind of filtering. In that kind of situation, you need to, for a slicer, you need to have a column, right? You cannot use a measure for a slicer. So in that case, you need to have the calculated column. Now the question is when to use a measure. That's what we discussed. If you want to perform some kind of percentage or ratio or some average aggregation functions, in that kind of situation, you can use it. Highlighted visuals. Use a value that reflects user selection of filters, slicer, highlighted visuals. You can use a measure, for example, conditional formatting. If the sales is between so and so value 0 to 500, to display the your table background color as red, so that so the users can understand, okay, these values or in these categories the sales is low. The red color tells me. And the next one is the amber color and green color. Green color tells me good profit, whereas the red color tells me negative margin or zero profit or less profit. You can highlight the visuals with colors, right? Using measure and all, you can do it. So you can do a ratio, you can calculate the ratio or percentage or any aggregations, like including ratio and percentage are kind of aggregation, isn't it? So you can do it using measure. If anything comes to measure, you tell them measure is meant for, we use the measure for calculating ratio, percentage, and total sales, that kind of aggregations, that kind of, we use the measure. Measure will get calculated on the fly. Whenever I make changes here in my slicer, the measure will get recalculated. Look here, if I select something different, the measure will get, so all these total sales, sum X, right, it will get executed on the fly. It will cause a burden on your CPU. Whereas the sales amount, it doesn't require CPU because we already calculated. This value is already readily available in my data set. It need not to calculate, right? So that is the difference. Okay, so far you learned the basics of DAX language. You know how to create the calculated column, and you have a good understanding of the common functions used in DAX, the basic functions. Okay, now it's time now to move to the next level in this language. Okay, after learning a solid theoretical background of the DAX, you'll be able to become a real DAX champion. Okay, so next we will